A very good evening to you all in India. Good afternoon and good morning to others from wherever you are joining. It is actually hard to maintain our sanity in these trying times. In the last 24 hours, approximately 3.79 lakh COVID cases have been reported in India. 3,645 died in one day. I'm not mentioning the world figures. These are only figures from India. Secondly, these are very conservative official figures. The actual figures are far too alarming. Probably none of us has remained unaffected. We have lost many teachers from Aligarh Muslim University. The last count was around 24, and many more are suffering. The department to which I belong lost two of its members, one teacher and an office staff in the last 10 hours or so. In such ominous times, we at Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, that is ASHA, and Ganga Jammi Heritage decided to show a thumb to the virus. We will continue with our programs to bring some reprieve to our lives and retain our sanity. We cannot be defeated. We will fight it out. Our students are suffering. The teaching is severely curtailed, but we will continue to do our bit till whenever we can. I would just say be positive and remain functional. Don't be caught down. Today we bring before you an illustrated lecture by Dr. Mehreen Razvi, who is going to speak on a single but significant portrait of Prince Salim as king. It was commissioned by Salim himself when at Allahabad between 1600 and 1601, where he had established his own court in opposition to his father's, that is Akbar's. And during this time, he had his artists create a portrait which presents him, Prince Salim, as the king, and in a more imperial manner than any portrait of Akbar that had ever been made. The visual importance of this painting, therefore, is not just in how striking it is, but in what it tells us about Salim's understanding of the uses to which imagery could be put to as a means of political propaganda, an understanding which would go to have a pivotal and primary role in the creation of a visual language of power once he was actually ruling as the Mughal Emperor. Dr. Mehreen Razvi is an art historian specializing in the art and architecture of Mughal South Asia. She is the deputy curator of the Nasser D. Khalili collection of Islamic art and the in-house editor for their publication series. She is also an associate editor for International Journal of Islamic Architecture, and since 2011 regularly teaches courses and lectures on Islamic and Indo-Islamic art at universities and museums in London. In 2019, she guest edited a special issue of South Asian Studies titled Resituating Mughal Architecture in the Persianate World: New Investigations and Analysis, in which her own article, From Function to Form, Chini Khana in Safavid and Mughal Architecture, appeared. She is currently co-guest editing a special issue of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society on Persianate painting to be published in 2021, and has an article accepted for inclusion, that is Power and Politics of Representation, picturing elite women in Il Khanate paintings. He has published extensively on aspects of Mughal art, architecture, and urbanism. A selection of her publications include Lahore's Badshahi Mosque, Spatial Interactions of the Sacred and the Secular, which was published in 2020, Patronage as Power in Appropriation, Constructing Jahangir's Mausoleum, which was a Mark publication in January 2019, A Sultan Before the Padshah, Questioning the Identification of the Turbaned Figure in Jahangir Preferring a Sufi Sheikh in Kings, as a Sufi Sheikh to Kings, which was published in 2016, and Where is the Greatest City in the East, the Mughal city of Lahore, in European travel accounts between 1556 to 1648, published in 2015 by Routledge. She has further shared her academic expertise with wider audiences through her participation and consultation for documentaries on the Taj Mahal, programming on BBC World Service Radio, BBC Two and BBC Four, participation in the Lahore and Jaipur literary festivals, and as an expert lecturer on cultural tours. Mehreen currently sits on the conference committee for the Association for Art History and the scientific committee for the conference Mosque Innovation in Object, Form and Function, which is planned for November 2021. I am really thankful to her that in spite of these dark, trying times, she readily agreed to be here with us. Please welcome Dr. Mehreen Chidda Razvi. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Razvi and Shagufta, and thank you for that warm introduction, Professor. I'd also like to thank the Allahabad Society of History and Archaeology and the Ganja Jamuni Heritage for inviting me to speak today and organizing this lecture series. And especially in these very sobering times, I thank you all for being here, for attending, for watching after. And I hope, for a brief time to be able to just provide some distraction and some lovely pictures, which I hope you will enjoy. So I will just share my screen now. So, in Allahabad, between 1600 and 1601, the artists Manohar and Mansoor created a portrait of the Mughal Prince Salim. I've been enamored and intrigued by this painting since 2011, when I saw it in person on display at the Reichberg Museum in Zurich for the Masters of Indian Painting exhibition being held there at the time. In the portrait, Salim sits cross-legged on an elaborately decorated gold throne. He sits proudly erect and with shoulders back, one hand on his right knee, while the other is raised to chest level, making a gesture of some sort. He is sumptuously dressed in a jama, which is embossed or embroidered in gold. The larger gold cartouches on his clothes each contain the figure of an animal. A dagger with a jeweled handle, within an even more elaborately bejeweled gold sheath, is tucked into his patka, or his waist sash. From his neck hangs a double strand of lustrous pearls, with smaller beads of a different, darker stone separating each from the next. A few jewels stud his turban. While Salim's body is presented to us full on, his face is in perfect profile as he gazes to his left. He rests against a deep red velvet bolster, also decorated with gold, the design of which echoes the pattern on Salim's jama. The throne on which Salim sits is an incredible piece of furniture. Raised on 4 legs, only 3 of which are visible to the viewer, it is cased in gold and ornamented further with what can be assumed is either enameling, painted decoration, or possibly painted inserts. It also has sculptural forms and jewels. It's a throne of dreams, and very likely was exactly that, a creation out of the imagination of Salim and his artists. The portrait exists in a vacuum. There is no sense of place, as the background is completely bare. The only context given to the image is the inscription in the cartouches which frame the enthroned prince. It is due to this inscription that we have such precise information about who the artists were and the date of production. And it is precisely this information which makes this such an interesting portrait. It is dated 1600 to 1601, a few years before Salim became emperor in 1605, taking the regnal title of Jahangir, which means that it was made while his father, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, was still very much alive and fulfilling the role of ruler. The date also lets us know that it was made in Allahabad, where Salim went and established his own court, in opposition to his father's, where he essentially, quote unquote, rebelled. And this was, in essence, a treasonous act. And during this treasonous period, he had his artists create a portrait which presents Salim as king, and in a more imperial manner than any portrait of Akbar that was ever made. The visual importance of this painting, therefore, is not just in how striking it is, but in what it tells us about Salim's understanding of the uses to which imagery could be put as a means of political propaganda, an understanding which would go on to have a pivotal and primary role in the creation of a visual language of power once he was actually ruling as the Mughal emperor. This visual language came to be a defining feature of Mughal painting for generations, and it is almost completely ubiquitous in Mughal painting from 1605, the first year of Jahangir's reign, onwards. I feel I should just state very clearly here, for those not as familiar with Mughal history, that Salim and Jahangir are the same person. Salim is the name he was given at birth, and Jahangir is the regnal title he adopted on becoming emperor. Both names will be used in my talk, depending on what stage of his royal life I'm referring to. The goal of my talk today is to contextualize this portrait of Salim enthroned in the St. Petersburg album within the wider framework of Salim's, and later Jahangir's, ruling ideology, and to make the argument that as a prince, Salim was already formulating how the interaction between the Mughal ideology of kingship and the visual meaning of painting, in particular portraiture, could be manipulated, that he was already thinking about how a visual language could be created and used to portray kingship. I'd also like to define some parameters of this before I continue. First of all, this paper is not going to look at style in Mughal painting, but rather symbolism and intent. Secondly, in contextualizing this portrait and what I believe is its prescient nature, comparative and other relevant imagery used to create my argument is drawn almost exclusively from images from the earlier reign of Akbar, Salim's father and immediate predecessor, from Salim's time in Allahabad, and works from his reign once he acceded to the Mughal throne as Jahangir in 1605. These will primarily be portraits showing the ruler enthroned within a courtly setting, or allegorical portraits. And when later images are used and discussed, it's to show continuity of themes. Imagery of the Mughal court, captured in written accounts during Akbar's reign, portray an opulent, luxurious, ridiculously wealthy entity, for which Akbar and his court gained fame in Europe and Asia. Painted images of courtly scenes by Mughal artists from this time indicate the grandeur of the court, but perhaps it can be said that they only hinted at the extreme wealth of the emperor, or the Padshah. However, during Jahangir's reign, there's a stark shift in how the Padshah began to be portrayed. The luxury and wealth for which he was famed is on display. Jahangir and his sons are typically represented wearing copious amounts of jewelry. The materials of their clothing are more luxurious. Accoutrements of the courts portray the wealth of the imperial treasury. In addition, it's during Jahangir's reign that iconography and allegorical imagery meant to convey Mughal imperial ideology first appears in Mughal painting. For example, they present the ruler giving off the radiant light of Far, a divinely ordained light that emanates from the ruler, symbolized by the incorporation of a halo in his portraits. They include symbolic representations of Solomonic kingship, referencing Jahangir as the perfect, just king, seen in the portrayal of the lion and the lamb lying together on the globe. They also convey the importance of the Mughals' dynastic line. On the left, Jahangir holds a portrait of his father, both haloed. And these paintings depict the Mughals' claim to divine universal kingship, which is manifested within the painted portraits through allegorical imagery taken from European sources. So, for example, in the painting on the right, Jahangir receives aid from the heavenly putti, the little angels. They're bringing a crown to put on his head, they're holding his chain of justice aloft in the heavens, and they're passing him the arrows with which he is ridding his kingdom of poverty. In short, some of the key elements which come to define Mughal painting from the early 17th century onwards only start to be seen after Jahangir's reign begins. While Jahangir has been receiving more and more scholarly attention since I began working on the art, architecture, and material culture of his reign more than 10 years ago, he still does not receive the credit he should for the formation of a visual language of power, which then goes on to permeate and define Mughal visual culture. And as a way of, working to change this narrative, this is what I want to share with you today. With the examination of this portrait of Jahangir while he was still a prince, made 4 to 5 years before his accession to the throne. Essentially, what I'm saying is that I think we can draw a straight line between these two particular images. For example, both are imperial. They present as their primary protagonist a figure who looks the part of a ruler, someone who projects strength, power, and wealth. But the one on the right, the famous painting of Jahangir preferring a Sufi sheikh to kings, exhibits many of the features we associate with royal Mughal portraits and imperial imagery. The use of the halo, the incorporation of European imagery and techniques of production, the realism and naturalism of the figures, the incorporation of allegorical symbols of European origin. All features are representative of what we can call a visual language of power that was created during Jahangir's reign as a direct result of his interest and his influence in the visual arts, and in the relationship that he had with his artists. These were also emblematic of his princely atelier. He was a hands-on patron, very involved with deciding what would be produced by his artists, and his desires and wants are what drove painting production. I want to again stress that this painting depicts Prince Salim in a way that is more imperial than any portrait made of his father, Akbar, a view also corroborated by the great scholar of Mughal painting, Milo Beach. Amusingly, in a seminal publication on the St. Petersburg album, when this painting is discussed, it's described as being a, quote, almost impertinently royal portrait. From the scale of the image to the opulence of the throne and Salim's costume, to the intertwining of image and text, there is not a single painting created of Akbar that can match this one of Salim in the presentation of an imperial figure. Of course, there were paintings and portraits made of Akbar, primarily for inclusion within illustrated versions of the Akbarname, the great history of his reign. In these, he, as the ruler, at times could easily blend into the compositions if he were not marked out by symbolic elements of kingship, including the placement of an umbrella or a shade over his head, the peacock fan bearer in close proximity, or the feather in his turban. In the audience scenes, when he is the figure seated on a platform or a throne, it's obviously immediately easier to recognize him as the ruler, even if his attire is much of the time quite drab. Within these compositions, despite the many individuals present, the eye is drawn to Akbar as the main figure due to the skillful artists who draw the eye, or even lead it, to the figure of the emperor. But very rarely is Akbar distinguished by his costume, by an overt use of jewelry, or any other imperial trappings. Sometimes a simple string of pearls or beads is around his neck, but his clothes seem at times almost utilitarian, not royal. In images where there are fewer people, or where he is receiving guests or prisoners, or is in an audience of some type, he's the most prominent figure, again marked out by the accoutrements of rulership, in these instances many times including a throne. Mughal thrones took various forms, but one of the more popularly illustrated types was an elevated platform seat, hexagonal in shape, seemingly appearing the most frequently, followed by octagonal, and then square or rectangular. At times, the throne has a high back, but even when this feature is not included, they almost always are enclosed with low sides, with a single or double opening for access. Of all the images of Akbar enthroned, this is probably the most royal, quote unquote, royal image of him I can think of in these situations, where his clothing is more luxurious than those around him. He wears multiple strings of jewels around his neck, and he has a qatar with a gold handle and a elaborately decorated gold sheath tucked into his patka. While here he sits on a beautifully decorated gold throne, occasionally Akbar is also depicted on one which is quite resplendently jeweled. And yet, these still do not compare with Salim's Allahabad portrait. So, what we are seeing in the portrait of Salim is that this new type of portrait is made, one which, as Beach highlights, immediately distinguishes Salim's patronage from that of his father. Beach then goes on to say that this portrait is, quote, a statement of aspiration, not fact, in which the rebellious Salim already shows quite different interests in visual imagery than those of his father, end quote. But I wonder if this is not entirely the case, and one, that this was not so much a statement of aspiration, so much as a challenge, and one which exemplifies not just a different interest in visual imagery, but a deeper understanding of what visual images, and in particular portraiture, could be utilized for, and the lengths to which they could be put to for the purposes of political propaganda. So in order to make this case, I'll discuss the ways in which this portrait of Salim enthroned foreshadows the changes and advancements in symbolic and allegorical meaning to come in Mughal painting once he reigns as Jahangir. But before I do, a little more information on the historical background to the painting's production will be given. Before Salim began his, quote, rebellion against Akbar in 1599 and established himself at Allahabad, he had for several years been chafing against the parameters put on him, and tensions between him and Akbar had increased, so much so, for example, that Salim refused to obey Akbar's orders relating to military matters. Salim even made a half-hearted attempt to march on Agra, the Mughal capital, before leaving for Allahabad. Salim was Akbar's eldest son and had essentially been named as his heir apparent, but he still desired an opportunity to rule and govern. And this was a tradition that was common amongst elite Timurid families, and which saw princes given the governorship of provinces while their fathers ruled empires. This was the case not only for the Mughals' Timurid ancestors, but also occurred under the first two rulers of the dynasty, Babur and Humayun. Akbar was the first to keep his sons close at court in their youth, later giving them command of armies and administrative positions, but under very tightly controlled circumstances. So this, in part, contributed to Salim's reasonings for rebelling. Once established in Allahabad, Salim went about expanding his court and his supporters, establishing a firm power base. During his time there, he was quite naughty. He attempted to march again on Agra. He referred to himself first as Sultan, then as Shah, meaning king, and finally as Padshah, the emperor. He had coins minted in his name there, and he had the Friday sermon, the khutbah, read in his name. These were acts that were reserved for the ruler. So, in other words, Salim carried out treasonous acts throughout his time in Allahabad, in addition to having committed the act of rebellion in the first place. Now, one of the things I find most interesting about Salim's time in Allahabad, which I think plays into this very frankly audacious creation of the St. Petersburg portraits, is that he seems to have been in essence permitted by Akbar to carry out this rebellion. Salim had an army of at least 30,000 with him, but the imperial army of Akbar vastly exceeded this. Despite Salim's numerous transgressions and aggrandizements, Akbar never brought Salim's insurrection to a halt, something which he could very easily have done. He in fact rewarded his son. So, for example, when Salim undertook the second march on Agra, Akbar demanded that Salim either dismiss his army and return to Agra or take his troops back to Allahabad. Salim chose the latter, avoiding military confrontation of any kind. And for this, continuing to stay away and not return to his father's court, Akbar awarded him with the governorship of Orissa and Bengal. Lisa Balaban-Lilar, in her recent study on Jahangir, raises the intriguing idea that in a way, Akbar was willing to tolerate Salim's rebellion as it gave his son the opportunity to govern and develop skills and relationships that would serve him when he became emperor. I think there's definitely something to this train of thought, including, as I'll attempt to show, in the artistic outputs of Salim's Allahabad atelier. So it was under these circumstances that the portrait of Salim enthroned was made. And when we examine it with this wider context of production in mind, a case can be made for its prescient nature, foreshadowing important elements of Mughal painting that will permeate the imperial atelier once Salim ascended to the Mughal throne. Beach, in his discussions of the Gulshan album, which was created in part during Salim's time in Allahabad, makes the case for Salim's atelier, not Akbar's, being the place where court artists were undertaking the, as he puts it, most extensive, inventive, and exciting developments in Mughal painting from the final years of the 16th century. So with that in mind, it seems fair to say that ideas of visual presentation that were tested in this portrait were able to be fully committed to and expanded once the imperial title was Salim's, and when he had the power to alter the course of Mughal artistic output. At the time of its production, Salim Enthroned was atypical in every way for a royal Mughal portrait. In its scale, the fact that it was on a bare ground, in the incredible detail of decoration on the throne, and in its overall imperial nature. I believe it is in aspects of these incredible outliers that we can see the foreshadowing of Jahangir's imperial painting production from the time of his accession in 1605 onwards. So I would like to now discuss these particular aspects of foreshadowing, of symbolic and allegorical meaning in Jahangiri era painting. And they are the importance of the portraits, the scale of the image, the unparalleled opulence of the throne, and the use of symbolism and allegorical imagery. So firstly, the importance of the portraits. The fact that we have a true portrait is really very interesting, and one which is more true to life than most of the portraits of Akbar ever created during his lifetime. Possibly the only one which could be considered a truer representation is a small brush drawing of Akbar in the British Library, in which a sense of pathos comes across so strongly. It is known that Akbar appreciated portraits. He sat for his own to be taken and ordered portraits of his courtiers to be created as well. And this was documented by his close confidant and biographer Abul Fazl. Abul Fazl also appears to enhance the meaning of portraits within his writings, saying, for example, in his Aini Akbari, that making a likeness was a source of wisdom. By the time Salim had his portraits in Allahabad made, Akbar's views on portraiture were already established and written down, so they were known to Salim. All the more reason, I think, to see in the creation of Salim's portrait a challenge. Akbar's portraits were all small scale, created primarily for inclusion within illustrated Akbarnames. In these, his is the likeness on which the most attention has been paid, to which attempts have been made to model the features and individualize them, but never, with the possible exception of the British Library sketch, to the extent we see in Salim's Allahabad portrait. As pointed out by Elaine Wright, despite the Akbarname being such a formal text, and one which exuded the written version of Mughal imperial ideology under Akbar, visually he was presented as less formal and less imperial. Within its genre of royal Mughal portraiture, Salim's is superior to those of Akbar's. There is much more of an attempt made by the artists of Salim's portrait, Manohar, to create a true likeness in comparison to the multiple depictions of Akbar we have. To be fair, Manohar is described as a pioneer in royal portraiture by John Seiler, and while he's referring to Manohar's portraits of Akbar, I would argue that this phrase is exemplified by Salim's portrait here instead. And indeed, in discussing this portrait, Seiler refers to it as the linchpin of Manohar's career in recognition of its magnificence. The accuracy of representation that Salim clearly expected of his portrait is indicative of his personal preferences. Throughout the Jahangir-name, Jahangir's autobiographical memoirs, the reader is made clearly aware of how interested he was in capturing the reality of life around him, and how, as a result, there's an increased technical precision in the portrayal of realistic, naturalistic images that occurred in his imperial atelier. And probably one of the most stark examples of this is when he ordered a painting made of his courtier Inayat Khan, who, due to an opium addiction, had wasted away to literally skin and bones. On seeing him, Jahangir writes that his appearance was so remarkable that he wanted his artists to paint it so that they could document what they saw. Such an interest was present in Salim while still a prince, and can be encapsulated in the vitality of the Allahabad portraits. If we accept the premise that portraits, when they are contemporary with their subjects, become a means of primary documentation, this idea of depicting reality becomes even more clearly in focus. It also seems clear that there was a psychological component being made here, permissible by the trust Salim placed in Manohar to create a portrait like no other seen before at the Mughal courts. The second element of Salim's portraits, which foreshadows what is to come in Mughal imperial production, is the importance of scale. As the only figure on a single piece of furniture, the scale of Salim and his throne are stupendous when compared with other works on paper of enthroned rulers. And I stress again that nothing like it had been produced at the Mughal court before. It is, of course, recognized that when Jahangir came to the throne, the paintings of the imperial atelier shifted from those produced by his fathers, in that typically there were less figures included, which meant that those who were created on a larger scale. And larger figures meant that the artist could create more detailed images of these individuals. There was also a greater interest in album production seen under Jahangir than under Akbar, which meant that more single-page compositions were created that included portraits, and more single-image portraits of the ruler were produced as well. Salim Enthroned very much foreshadows this type of production, of a single image of a prince or a ruler, which becomes very popular, focusing the eye directly on the individual portrayed. In addition to the scale of the image, the fact that it is left on a bare ground makes it even more striking and impactful. This aspect of the painting will be returned to shortly. As mentioned earlier, under Jahangir, there's a sharp shift in displaying the wealth, opulence, and luxury of the Mughal courts in painting, and this too, I would argue, is foreshadowed in the Allahabad portrait. In his imperial depictions as emperor, Jahangir, the royal princes, and to some extent the courtly elite are depicted in more luxurious clothing. They are bejeweled, and the courtly settings are more elaborate and sumptuous. The wealth that is pictured on Jahangir's person is phenomenal. In the strings and ropes of pearls and jewels he wears, including on his turban, in the jeweled bazu bands that encircle his upper arms, in the multiple rings of gold and precious stones or jade that he wears, in the priceless materials of the daggers and swords that they are encased within, and the same lavishness is seen in the depictions of furnishings, in the material of the cloth, and in the other courtly accoutrements. One of the most extravagant of which is the depiction of a large weighing scale used to weigh Prince Khurram on his birthday. The scale is covered in gold and studded with precious jewels. In the paintings of Jahangir's reign, this display of splendor becomes normal, and once normalized, continues in Mughal paintings of subsequent reigns. But before Jahangir was emperor, in the paintings produced under Akbar, this was far from the norm. This could have been a stylistic choice, an issue of scale, or for some other reason. What is unquestionable, however, is that Salim's throne in the Allahabad portrait was unique in its magnificence when it was created. I'd mentioned above that one of the markers of kingship seen in portraits was the incorporation of an umbrella, or sometimes a parasol or a textile canopy to cover the head of the ruler, including when rulers were enthroned. With Salim's portrait, a covering of any sort is dispensed with. Possibly because of the opulence of the throne, Salim felt comfortable without the inclusion of a parasol or canopy above him, despite their inclusion being a marker of rulership and a typical hallmark of enthronement scenes. Not only did later depictions of thrones become more elaborate in paintings, but actual thrones of Jahangir and Shah Jahan were more elaborately constructed. Jahangir, for example, writes in the Jahangirname of the throne he was gifted by his father-in-law and prime minister, Itimaduddaulah, which he describes as an extremely elaborate and intricate throne of gold and silver. The legs were made in the shape of lions holding up the throne. And of course, Shah Jahan commissioned the Great Peacock Throne, a throne covered in gold and studded with all the loose gems and pearls in the imperial treasury. Coming now to the last area, in which Salim's Allahabad portrait foreshadows the visual language of kingship formulated during Jahangir's reign, the category of symbolism and allegorical imagery. There are several ways in which I believe this painting anticipates Jahangir's overt use of these pictorial methods, the first of which is in the animals portrayed on the throne. In the output of his imperial atelier, Jahangir introduces the imagery of the lion and the lamb as an allegorical representation symbolic of Solomonic kingship, which is to say, visualizing the concept of Jahangir ruling as a just, wise king over a peaceful kingdom that benefits from his perfect rule. Some of the most magnificent of such representations can be seen in Jahangir's allegorical dream paintings, in which the lion and lamb lie together peacefully beneath Jahangir's feet, neither giving into their baser instincts, because of the purity of Jahangir's realm and the control he has over it. However, it seems that even while in Allahabad, this visual combination was being explicitly used in relation to Solomon himself in a Divan of Hafiz, a volume of collected poems that Salim commissioned while in Allahabad. In this Divan is included a painting of King Solomon enthroned with jinns, birds, and animals. Depicted in front of Solomon's throne are a collection of animals which would typically fall into the categories of hunter and their prey, a lion and a cheetah, and a sheep, a goat, and a rabbit. As Malini Roy and Jerry Losty points out, this is a very early pre-imperial example of Salim's use of biblical messianic symbolism for his own purposes, used in this instance to visualize the peaceful nature of Solomon's kingdom. Later, this imagery is taken and allegorically applied to his portraits to represent his imperial ideology of rulership. Coming back to Salim enthroned, I believe a case can be made for stating that in this image on the throne, references to Solomonic kingship are present through the incorporation of multiple birds decorating it. Of Solomon's many traits, he is said to have been able to speak the language of birds, and it was of course the hoopoe who was the messenger between him and the Queen of Sheba, named as Bilqis in the Muslim tradition. Birds, therefore, are frequently associated with Solomon, and this includes, of course, the simurgh. On Salim's throne, birds abound, in the cartouche band below the seat and on the high backrest, where they are intertwined in a foliate arabesque on a blue ground. The placement of a simurgh on the octagonal star directly below the opening to the platform throne seat seems significant, a purposeful placement in that particular position that would indicate symbolic importance. Perhaps it is meant to portray the idea visualized in this Timurid painting of the simurgh before the throne of Solomon. Simurghs later featured prominently in Jahangir's Kala Burj at the Lahore fort as a means of portraying Solomonic kingship, as argued by Ebba Koch, and features also on the famous tiled picture wall of the Lahore fort, started by Jahangir, which is resplendent with other references to Solomonic imagery as well. A further importance given to the depiction of birds on this particular throne is made by Anna Malika in her study of Mughal thrones and solar symbolism. One of the birds she singles out for mention is the light falcon, depicted in combat. She writes that the Mughals followed their Turkish ancestors in considering light falcons to be imperial birds because, in court poetry, they were associated with the sun and with royalty. Stepping away from Solomonic symbolism, but still examining animals on the throne, there are two hunting scenes on the front, one to either side of the Simurgh star. In these two stellate cartouches are representations of a feline taking down an ungulate. To the right is a lioness attacking a deer, and to the left is a cheetah and a black buck. In addition, within the throne, on the interior rim of the platform, mythical and real animals appear to be in a chase. The two visible to the right are inspired by Chinese qilin, with their characteristic trailing flame motif coming off of their forelegs, while the two others visible on the back of the throne are the same types of deer being attacked in the star cartouches. Such visible and overt hunting imagery is rife with symbolism. On the idea of the hunt itself, hunting was a royal pastime and had symbolic importance as a way through which a ruler was able to portray their courage and their fitness to rule and their means of protecting their subjects. And it's likely these reasons, posits Elaine writes, that in part prompted Salim to commission a shikarname, a hunting album, while at his court in Allahabad, where he was presenting himself as king. The hunt was further reflective of good governance and administration, and so having such explicit hunting imagery visible on the throne was a way for Salim to present these attributes of his ruling ability. I think it the case that these images had further symbolism as well. On the feline ungulate attacks on the front of the throne, the iconography of a lion attacking a deer has a long history as a symbol of a stronger power defeating a weaker one, and specifically within the Iranian Persianate cultural sphere was an old symbol of Nowruz, of the sun overcoming the power of darkness. So this particular image is doing some heavy lifting, conveying the symbolism of the Mughal hunt as representative of the ability to capably rule, of political power and acumen, and also of a Persianate cultural tradition. Its partner, the depiction of the cheetah taking down the black buck, it can be argued, has another layer of meaning beyond the associations of the hunt as well. In contrast to the lion deer image, which has a wider geographic resonance which can be considered Persianate, here we have a local type of deer, the black buck. Is it too much of a stretch to see in these two cartouches a reflection of Salim's shared heritage, his Timurid bloodline through his father and his Hindu Rajput bloodline through his mother? Salim was the first Mughal prince to not be purely Timurid, his mother being a Rajput princess, and subsequently he was then also the first Mughal emperor with this mixed heritage. Akbar had already incorporated aspects of local Hindu ceremonials and activities into the courtly culture, and more importantly, incorporated aspects into his imperial ideology of rule, making associations, for example, between himself and Rama. Salim was aware of this, and as he had a true claim to this kind of local cultural heritage, It seems reasonable that he would also in some way want to reflect these two sides of his bloodline, which in essence meant two sources of power. This nod to his Rajput side is evident as well, I would argue, in some of the decorative elements of the back of the throne, where Hamza heads, or geese heads, are prominently displayed, as are lotus blossoms at the top of the three finials on the back of the throne. Hamzas and the lotus flower have, of course, deep symbolic importance within the Vedic traditions. But having said this, these could also be reflective of rooting Salim into the local socio-political landscape. But just as it's possible to see multiple layers of symbolism given to a single image, we see that the same can be said of the Hamzas, because they could equally be interpreted as duck heads. Malika has noted that ducks were linked to Solomon, as they could both walk on earth and fly in the sky. It's possible, therefore, that elements of the throne's design were chosen because of their multiple layers of meaning, and were designed to have a far-reaching resonance, regardless of who the viewer was. In paintings produced at Jahangir's imperial atelier, allegorical means were frequently employed to portray Jahangir as a universal sovereign, the ruler of both the temporal and spiritual realm, and to visualize also that he and his line were divinely ordained to rule. In the St. Petersburg portrait of Salim, I would argue that we're seeing the beginnings of Salim's awareness for how the use of pictorial image can be used to reflect the concept of universal kingship. This can be seen in the features just discussed, which represent a diverse society over which he rules, but also a wider Persianate cultural sphere. Additionally, recall that in the portrayal of animals on the throne, both mythical as well as real animals are depicted, and that the mythical animals are quite prominently placed. Perhaps this is an even more overt expression of images alluding to the idea of universal kingship by proclaiming Salim's supremacy over both mythical and real animals, which perhaps are meant to be representative of both mystical and temporal realms. These animals are placed on the throne that supports Salim. In other words, he rules over them. There is yet another element of importance, which can be read into Salim's portrait around the universality of the image. Because the portrait exists in a void, with a bare background, in a state that transcends space, place, and time, I think a case could be made for the creation of a universality Salim as the Pacha, as the emperor. We're invited to gaze upon the emperor without any visual background noise, without the ability to root him in a specific place or time. Our eye has nowhere to go except to him and his throne, and so it is to them we're drawn in to gaze upon and admire the details of the paintings, which themselves relay important symbolism to his role as emperor. Gazing at Salim, we're also led to follow his own gaze. Where is he looking? He gazes intently to his left, and since there's nothing within his setting for him to see, he gazes, as Susan Strong has pointed out, at the inscription verse which names him as emperor. As translated by Wheeler Thaxton, the full inscription reads, "In the time of the lion-capturing prince, in essence the glorifier of the 9 thrones, from the fortune of that orthodox prince a beggar would acquire the income of Byzantium and China. In a year when the treasure-bestowing prince rode his steed out to chastise the Rana, Manohar, who with the stroke of his princely approved pen would cause sperm to take shape in the womb, drew a likeness of a king as glorious as Jamshed. Mansur's brush worked on it. Now, like Hassani, without error seek the year from the words, likeness of the emperor." It is this last phrase, likeness of the emperor, which gives us the date of the painting. It's a chronogram that gives the dates of 1009 al-Hijri, meaning July 1600 to July 1601. And it is this part of the inscription, Susan Strong tells us, that Salim is gazing at. This painting was likely created for inclusion within a muraka, an album, a compilation of calligraphies and paintings or drawings within a single bound volume. Because of the orientation of Salim and the directionality of the image, it must have been on the left-hand side of an opening. Remember that in the Islamic Persianate tradition with which we are dealing, manuscripts open from left to right, and you read right to left. As it is such an imperial image, it seems likely that it was probably intended to be the opening image of an album, without a corresponding image to its right. After being taken from the Mughal royal library to Iran, when Nader Shah sacked Delhi in 1739, it was given new margins, placed into an album, and paired with another portrait to its right. We know that while albums were made during Akbar's reign, they were much more popular during Jahangir's, and even as a prince, he was interested in their production. We know, for example, that there were 3 albums started for Salim before his accession: the Salim album, the Shikarname I already mentioned, and the Gulshan album. Started in Agra before his rebellion or in Allahabad, these 3 albums exemplify Salim's early interest in this format of production. And as such, the St. Petersburg portrait folio appears to be one of the early examples of an album page produced for Salim, in which there's such an intertwining between a single image and the associated text placed around it. The symbolic meaning of the words resonates with the painting, infusing it with an extra layer, or perhaps a better way of phrasing it would be a more explicit layer of symbolic meaning. It's still the case that the created image is the primary focus, but the chosen words to accompany it complete the totality of the message that the folio is meant to convey, that of Salim the Padshah. So to conclude, while this portrait has been rightly feted for its magnificence, it should also be highly regarded for what it can tell us about the Mughal Prince Salim as a patron, about his interest in the arts, but most importantly, that he exhibited an early awareness of how to utilize painting, and in particular portraiture, for, in essence, propaganda. While this portrait is missing the allegorical and symbolic iconographic imagery we tend to associate with portraits of Jahangir, at the time it was made, in the final years of his time as a prince, during a period of rebellion against his father, the emperor, it was created within the confines of an established imagery, while at the same time breaking loose of those parameters in almost every single way. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let us have the questions. Shagufta, can you put up the questions? Yes. Ali Heather asks, Madam, doesn't this portrait of Jahangir sitting powerfully on a throne suggest that he was not a lazy ruler who busied himself in drinking opium all the time, as he was often criticized for being so? And do we know the name of the throne on which he is depicted sitting on?
Well, thank you, Ali, for that question. So just the last part first. The throne is imaginary. There's no kind of written evidence or any other pictorial evidence that it ever existed. So it's a figment of the painter's imagination, of Salim's imagination. In terms of this idea that he was, a drunk and addicted to opium and lazy, I mean, he was addicted to opium. He did enjoy his alcohol. He did succumb to drunkism quite frequently. But I think he has been unfairly maligned as well in history as this ruler who just kind of gave over every vestige of power to, his wife Noor Jahan when they married, and that there were other people who were running the empire in his stead. At the end of the day, he is the ruler, and anything that was happening with his authority and with his, with his approval. And so, yes, he does get to a point where he writes about it in the Jahangir Name that he's too addicted to opium, he's too addicted to wine, and he knows he has to cut back for his own health. So he's very frank about his flaws, but he still is the ruler. So yeah, this idea which has persisted that he was very lazy, that he didn't take an interest in ruling his empire, is a false narrative, which I'm happy to see more recent scholarship is challenging.
Right. Uh,
It is also a very interesting question, not really related to this. But Nikhil Sheth asks, why is Mughal studies so fashionable? Books so it's sellable and papers publishable compared to Sultanate era, apart from handful of good scholars.
So thank you, Nikhil, for that question. Um, I I don't have a precise answer for you. I mean, it could be a combination of any number of factors. I mean, there has been much more interest in the Sultanate era in the last few years, and there have been some really excellent studies which have come out. And obviously, as we see, like Professor Kumar was one of the people driving the interest in Sultanate studies for a while, and I was very fortunate to meet him a few times and discuss some things with him. But within within academia, within history, the interest in different periods goes in waves. And the Mughals, there was a lot of interest in them. There still is, but I think now we can definitely say that that interest in the historical backdrop of South Asia is expanding. So not just in terms of studies being done on the Sultanate era, but also in the Deccan. If we're talking about the Muslim history of South Asia, and so there is quite a lot of work being done by very, very, very good historians and art historians and scholars. So yeah, keep the eye out for other things you could look to find out more about that.
Mirza Hassan, if Mughal art during Jahangir's time was having the European influence, then why the art of sculpture making, as was present in Europe, did not become a prominent in Mughal Empire, and was throne of Mughal emperors prior to Shah Jahan equally lavish as the Peacock throne?
Okay, thank you for that. So the first part of that question, um, when we talk about European impacts into Mughal material culture, um, you have to think about the type of objects which are coming into the court, into the sphere of the court that the artists are looking at. And these have to be very, just by their nature, they have to be small, portable objects. So we know that not only do we have works on paper in terms of, printed books and paintings and engravings which are coming into the Mughal court that the royal family is interested in, that their artists are looking at and they're copying. We do know that there were small scale sculptures that were seen as well. So, for example, when the Jesuits came and they established their churches, they had all their churchly accoutrements, including some sculptures. And we know that there were quite a few sculptures produced in Goa, for example, for the kind of Christian population there. But when we talk about Mughal sculpture, we again have to kind of have a different notion of what sculpture is, because we have um, in terms of surviving objects, there are a few kind of large scale, kind of architectural, sculptural entities. So, for example, in the forts, you would have the hathi poles, the elephant gates. And from the paintings we know and descriptions, we know that there were sculpted elephants that were, on either side of these gates. And Abacock has done work on these two elephant sculptures, which Jahangir actually commissioned on the route to Kashmir. And so there were these few kind of large scale sculptures that were made. But otherwise, we're actually talking about objects on a very small scale. So, for example, if you think about the daggers that the Mughals produced, the dagger handles sometimes end in sculptures of animal heads or some other kind of form. You can think of the amazing wine cup, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum here in London, Shah Jahan's wine cup, which is this incredible sculptured gourd with a ram's head as a handle. So we don't think of sculpture in the Mughal context in the same way we think about it in the European context, but it does exist. and is really exquisite when you look at it. Oh, and sorry, the second part of that. The throne of the emperors prior to Shah Jahan being equally lavish as the peacock throne. There were incredible thrones that were produced. So, for example, I mentioned the one that Ithamad presented to Jahangir, which was carved of silver and gold and had lion pedestals as the feet. But in terms of sumptuousness and lavishness, I don't think there would have been anything like the peacock throne, because it was made entirely of gold and was studded with all the loose pearls and gems of the treasury. And it was, at the time it was produced, which was 1631, at that time the cost would have been, like 1 billion rupees, so priceless to make. And unfortunately lost to history after Nadir Shah took it back to Iran.
Well, Mirza Hassan, I think the first part of your question is also related to the fact that the Mughal artist or artists would only draw or be inspired from those objects which were imported into India, into the Mughal court, by the you know European travelers and merchants, and that is why we find that the paintings, the printed books, the polyglot Bible. I mean, these are the objects which make their appearance and are being copied by the Mughal artists. The type of sculptures which were practiced and known in Europe, the poor Indian artist was never exposed to that, number one. Number two, uh, except possibly Akbar, none of the other Mughals preferred to have the life forms being sculpted to such an extent as it took place under Akbar. I mean, Mehreen just mentioned about to you the elephants. This is more an Indian tradition than any derivative sculptural tradition from Europe. I mean, the life-size elephant sculptures were known in India. These sculptors, stone cutters, they were used to that and they were producing it.
Well, yes, and also, I mean, there's such a long history of sculptural tradition in India anyway, outside of the
Right.
Mughal context. It's very much a art form rooted in the area, so it didn't need, an external source to inspire
Exactly.
sculpture.
And I mean, I would just, I'm repeating myself. I mean, I have repeated that during this series at least 3 or 4 times, that in Akbar's Fatehpur Sikri, sculptures are found on the buildings, which were used by Akbar himself. So we cannot say that sculptures, I mean, peacocks were drawn, birds were drawn, life forms were drawn. In fact, in a building which is known as Abdar Khana, on the dados, there are still, traces of human portraits, possibly which had once been made. Those portraits are no more there, but you can, if you take a photograph, you will find the whole silhouettes of 3 or 4 people who are standing in line. So that is there. As far as the Mughal thrones are concerned, Mehreen has already answered that, but just to add something to that, Akbar's reign is the reign of simplicity. Uh, Basic platforms would do. In fact, when he started having the Ibadat Khana discussions and so on and so forth, when he started uh, having mystical experiences, he chose a natural rock to sit upon and think about God. So you look at all these paintings, and Mehreen today showed you a number of paintings where his thrones are very simple. They may be sometimes octagonal, they may be square, but hardly any decorations on that. Just like hardly any colorful, exquisite clothing on the body of the emperor himself. Uh, so it all starts with Jahangir, and possibly this image which Mehreen showed us of Prince Salim acting as the emperor, sitting on an exquisite throne. It reminds you more of Shahjahani thrones than the thrones which were made earlier. So there was a gradual development in that, and by Shah Jahan's time, we hear of opulence, we hear of jewels and gold and silver and whatnot going into the making of. I mean, look at the Ibadat Khana painting, where Akbar is shown sitting on a throne. Look at the court scenes from Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar sitting on the thrones. Very simple. Look at the thrones of Jahangir himself. Uh, most of them, naturally, they are better than what Akbar was sitting upon, but far, far inferior to the exquisite thrones of Shah Jahan. Hmm. So there was an evolution of even this. I'm sorry I interjected so much in that.
Not at all.
Right, next question. What does the use of the term Pacha in the inscription at a time when Salim was not yet enthroned as emperor tell us?
It tells us that he was, well, not quite delusions of grandeur, but certainly that he, he's challenging Akbar. He set himself up at this court. He's calling himself Padshah, and acting to all extensive purposes as the emperor of the province of Allahabad. But like I said, he's being allowed to do this. So this is quite an audacious, it's an audacious portrait, it's an audacious inscription, where he is overtly making this claim, in this very visual manner, that he is the ruler. And I mean, really, it's one of the things we always have to think about when we are looking at these paintings is who's seeing them. And so really the audience for this particular portrait would have been very, very small. It's not something that Akbar would have seen, because he's in Agra, Salim's in Allahabad. It's something that Salim would have shown to, his intimates. It would have been probably known about his court. But in many instances, it's also simply the act of making something and the act of having such an inscription, which kind of gives it this kind of talismanic quality, this talismanic power. And so the fact that he is proclaiming himself as emperor is this very, very kind of potent symbol, that he's making before he actually then becomes emperor.
Yes, I mean, not only that, but what we find is that at a time when he rebels at Allahabad, he not only mm, uh, commissions this painting, takes up the title of uh, Shah or Shahenshah, but also has coins struck in his own name. That was, in fact, for the first time under the Mughal rule that an emperor was alive, and yet the royal prerogative was being,
Usurped.
usurped by a usurper. And as Mehreen keeps on telling you that um, uh, Akbar doesn't seem to mind it so much, or is it that he was by this time not in a position to mind? Because the type of politics which was going on in court during that period, possibly Akbar was acting very wise. Not only all this, Jahangir had Abul Fazl murdered And although Abul Fazl was not a grandee in the sense that he was holding the highest rank or something, he was holding a very minor rank, mediocre rank, you may say, but he was the confidant of the emperor. And Akbar, in fact, was much disturbed by the murder, but nothing happened.
Yeah.
Nothing happened. At the most, he got angry with the Bundula chieftain who actually got the Abul Fazl murder.
Yeah. It's probably also important to mention that, Salim had two younger brothers who both were dead by this point, or very close to dying at this point. They both died of, alcohol-related issues. And so, Akbar has this, son who he's named as his heir apparent, who's rebelling against him, who's calling himself king, but really he has no one else that he could pass the throne on to unless he skipped Salim altogether and gave it to Salim's son, which led to a whole other, host of political issues once Jahangir actually comes to the throne.
Right. Next question, please. Does Prince Salim portray himself as a religious figure, and was it accepted?
Um, in essence, no, not in terms of thinking about okay, this could either be very easy or very complicated to answer. So does he present himself as a religious figure? No, he doesn't present himself as a sheikh. He doesn't present himself as a imam. He doesn't present himself as a member of the ulama. But tied into the notion of Mughal kingship and imperial ideology as it was first established and projected by Akbar in his Akbarname. And then with Jahangir and the subsequent rulers, there is this, there's this concept that, and I mentioned the idea of the Mughal emperor being ruler over both the spiritual and the temporal realm. So they don't claim to be divine. They don't claim that they are, like a head of a religious body, Akbar being an exception. But they utilize the notions of certain notions of spirituality and mysticism to make this claim that they have this rulership over both the temporal and spiritual worlds. So, like I said, it could be a very quick answer. It could be a much more complicated answer, but it lies between those kind of two extremes.
Well, I would answer it in this fashion that there is a difference between religion and divinity.
Hmm.
Uh, mm, the Mughals, especially Akbar and Jahangir, uh, were believers in divinity. They took their claim to divine kingship very seriously. Uh, but neither Akbar nor Jahangir ever took the help of religion to put forward their divine origins of kings. Uh, I will explain it in the way that when Abul Fazl starts defining the kingship under Akbar, he invokes the legend of Ellen Khoa, the grandmother of Genghis Khan, a non-Muslim, in fact, a destroyer of the uh, Islamic places like Baghdad. So there is a legend of Ellen Khoa, which, according to which Ellen Khoa, just like Mother Mary, was impregnated by the sun god, and the sun god visited her tent, her yurt, at least 3 times. So she had 3 sons. All these 3 sons were thus sons of the god himself. They were all divines. One of them was the father of Changiz. And Abul Fazl says that this divine conception, this semen of the god, traveled from womb to womb until it came to the womb of Akbar's mother, and Akbar was born. So Akbar is a divine king, no doubt. But none of the Islamic theories is being invoked to put forward his claims to divinity. And that is why you would find that throughout, Akbar's period, there is much stress which is given to legends of Mary and Jesus. So much so that by Jahangir's period, uh, both these Jesus and Mary image become very, very popular as far as Mughal art is concerned, because this is something which they incorporate via Al into their own theory. They also claim, both Akbar and Jahangir, that they are Noor ala Noor, basing themselves on the Ishraqi philosophy, an Iranian philosophy, uh, the philosophy of light, divine light. So, unlike the previous Turkish divine concepts of Zillallah, the dark shadow of God, you have an illumined, bright, divine light emanating from God, which is kingship. Jahangir further tells us that he followed in toto whatever was done during his father's reign. And he's very clear in stating that I, as far as my policy of religion is concerned, I followed the same, or the kingship, as was being practiced under my revered father. But later on, there were a number of legends which were added by the Naqshbandiya Sufi silsilas, who tried to emphasize the role of Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi and tried to show that actually Jahangir was, a very pious Muslim king as opposed to his father. And it was with the intervention of people like Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi that Prince Salim was made the king, and he once again started following the rule of Islam. That is something which has been, I mean, circulated by the Mujaddidiya, silsila, for which we have no actual evidence anywhere. In fact, you look at the discussions, the Ibadat Khana discussions, which were taking place during the reign of Jahangir, not under the reign of Akbar, under Jahangir. His questioning of God and Islam is actually much more critical than Akbar had ever let it happen in his Ibadat Khana discussions. So, in a way, we can say that what I'm trying to derive at, it's a full topic. I mean, you need an hour to talk on that. In short, Jahangir, just like Akbar, believed in divinity, but not religion. Zainab Naqvi, thanks for the lecture. Is there any reference for the purpose of portraiture of nobles at the atelier of Akbar and Jahangir relating to physiognomy, and with reference to sovereignty and symbolism in the painting of Jahangir shooting the severed head of Malik Ambar? Is there any specific interpretation as to why the emperor stands on a buffalo and a whale?
Thank you for the question, Zainab. So in terms of the purpose of portraiture relating to physiognomy, um, beyond the most kind of basic reason, which is to present the reality of what we're seeing at the Mughal courts. No, I mean there was this interest in portraying, the reality of what's being seen around them, and this starts during Akbar's reign. Akbar's the one who has his artists first start to make portraits of the courtiers, and it's written about in the Akbarname that he wants to, to have these portraits done. He's preserving these images of these people for the future. So you have this kind of uh, you can kind of think of it as a picture book of all the people who are at the courts, and all their portraits are being made, and they're all being labeled, so you know exactly who they are. And just as an aside to that, in terms of these portraits which are made, they get utilized in later paintings as well, because once you have the portrait of a particular individual, you can then just copy it over into another painting. So those grand court scenes that we see, where there's many people in the audience, you'll notice from kind of the end of Akbar's reign, but certainly from Jahangir's reign, you see the same person being depicted each time, because you now have a stock image which can be replicated. So you can replicate a true image of the courtiers and of the individuals to put into paintings. But in terms of the idea that the the portrait can tell you something about a person, about their personality. Nothing like that comes into the production of these portraits. And there's not this idea that if you make the copy of a person, you're kind of captivating them in some way. There's nothing like that. So at the most kind of basic level, it's about presenting the reality of what is being seen at the courts, and then perpetuating that in the images which are being produced. With that incredible painting of Jahangir shooting the head of Malik Ambar, yes, there is a specific interpretation. So with that one, Jahangir is standing on a globe. The globe is resting on the back of the bull. The bull is standing on a fish. And that combination, the bull and the fish, is related to notions of Hindu cosmology and how the world was created and how it was supported. So remember when I was talking about the throne, I was talking about this idea of images having multiple layers of meaning. And so in that particular portrait, in that particular painting of Jahangir shooting the head of Malik Ambar, there's so much symbolism throughout it. But that particular combination of the bull and the fish is referring to Hindu cosmological thought.
Right. I will just add one tidbit to what Mehreen has said, and that is that once when the European merchants came to, or an embassy in fact, came to the court of Jahangir, actually I am forgetting whether it was Akbar or Jahangir, possibly if I remember correctly, it was Jahangir. The emperor asked one of his painters to bring a portrait of the European ruler, I mean, which the Europeans had brought, and asked them to copy it. And after it was copied, the European, embassy was once again asked to reconfirm has it been made correctly or not.
You're talking about when Thomas Roe, the ambassador
Thomas
from
More.
England, came to
Right,
Jahangir's court, and he
right.
had a portrait of a female who was very
Ah,
special to him, and he showed it to Jahangir, and Jahangir wanted it.
ah,
And Roe said, "I will give you anything, but this is too precious to me." So then Jahangir asked him to leave the portrait with him, and then he had his artists copy it, and then
and
asked
what?
Roe to pick the original when he comes back. And there's like 6 of them laid out. And Roe ultimately does pick the original, but it takes him time because the copies are so good.
Right. Mirza Hassan has asked if Mughal art during Jahangir's time was
We've had
having.
this one already.
Pardon?
We've had this question already.
Okay, next one, please. Next one. Is there any connection between throne and the king personally and ideology? Aurangzeb is never shown sitting on such thrones. Arey bhai, before he asks, did ever Aurangzeb have time to sit on the throne?
Well, and if he did, if he would have been sitting on the peacock throne, right? Because that was still then. So, um, yeah, the connection between the throne and the king's personality and ideology. I mean, you know, Aurangzeb is an emperor at the end of the day, and whatever kind of ideas there are about him, he was a ruler. He was an emperor. He of course sat on thrones. I don't. I can't remember off the top of my head if he commissioned any, but certainly Shah Jahan had already commissioned the Peacock Throne. He'd already commissioned the great, the marble Pietra Dura Jaroka throne, which is still in Delhi today. At every single fort in every single city, there would have been a throne that the emperor would have sat on when they were there. So the connection between the throne and kingly ideology, I mean, it's intertwined. Um, Whatever form the throne took, it was a throne, and it was imperative to have this kind of visual space for the emperor to be enthroned whenever they were in their courtly settings. And some of them were portable as well. So whenever the emperor was on the move, which was very frequent, the thrones traveled with them, or a throne traveled with them, so they could establish the true, presence of a court even when they were on the move.
There is a question by Hasnain Aziz. I don't know whether it has been put up or not. Madam, doesn't these powerful portraits suggest that Jahangir had more power over Mughal Empire than Empress Nur Jahan?
Well, I certainly hope so, because Jahangir was the emperor. So, yes, so this was something I alluded to before, this idea that, that has been historically perpetuated about Jahangir being somebody who was not interested in ruling, who was not interested in, who was just interested in fun and drinking and opium and women, and the idea that, yeah, Nur Jahan took complete control. Um, this is really a very uh, old-fashioned way of thinking of things, I would say. And you have to remember as well that when okay, so I'm going to bring this back to the notion of politics and political power and history being written by winners. So for the longest time, Jahangir, Nur Jahan, Shah Jahan are all very happily working together to have Shah Jahan come to the throne after Jahangir dies. This situation changes when Nur Jahan marries her daughter to another of Jahangir's sons, Shahryar, and she starts to turn Jahangir away from Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan still ultimately becomes the next emperor. He hates Nur Jahan. He hates her. He writes, in some of his court histories, you get these really visceral words about how awful she is. Um, and so she is kind of vilified in the historical record once Shah Jahan comes to the throne, but not only in the Mughal record, but in the European record as well. Because you have, even from Jahangir's time, Europeans who are coming to the courts and who are writing about how Nur Jahan is the one who controls everything and she is the one who rules everything. And there is this, you have to take into account um, the time period and who's writing it and what's going into these writings. And so Nur Jahan has really been vilified from the contemporary 17th century period onwards. And the idea that she uh, grasped the reins from Jahangir is not really true. Any references we have to Nur Jahan in the Jahangir Name, Jahangir refers to her in um, in a very glowing way, but never in any way which at all indicates that she is overstepping any bounds, that she has like taken control from him. And I mentioned before, we have to remember that anything, any powers that she had, because she was given powers no Mughal queen had been given before her, but she was given them. He gave them to her. So she was allowed to mint coins. She was allowed to have drums beat her presence into the court. And these were rights that queens didn't have before. Then they continue. So then, for example, Mumtaz Mahal has these rights. Jahanara, Shah Jahan's daughter, has these rights. So it's like Noor Jahan is the first of these powerful Mughal women who are very active at the court. And let me just clarify, the Mughal royal women were powerful before, and they were active in the court, but more behind the scenes. Noor Jahan comes to the forefront, as do then some of the other Mughal women after her. So I just want to say be aware of these external things which have come together, to give this idea of Jahangir being in thrall of Noor Jahan and not really taking an interest in running his kingdom, because that's not true.
Mehreen, with your permission, I would also like to speak on this topic.
Oh, of course.
Uh, I would point out two things to you. One, that the European writers of the colonial period, people like Vincent Smith and other such historians, they started to pick up and magnify whenever they found or they were uncomfortable with the fact that a woman was enjoying power. Petticoat government, Mahamanaga. It has now been proved that there was no petticoat government at all. I mean, why don't you talk about the parent governments then? Why petticoat government? Why is Smith so much stressing on this fact? The fact that Noor Jahan is holding a gun. But have you forgotten that even at a time when Babur was in Central Asia, roaming in the wilds of Central Asia, Samarkand and those places, even at that time, whenever he would go on a war, he would consult his women, his aunts, his elder cousins, so on and so forth. Why do you forget that Gulbadan Bano Begum, the daughter of Babur, was more literate than the son and uh, any of the other people in the court? In fact, Gulbadan Bano Begum's own husband, who was also a prince, was almost illiterate. But Gulbadan Bano Begum was one of those who was the literate of that period. Hmm. Throughout the Mughal period, whether it is the reign of Akbar or it is the reign of Shah Jahan, and that has been hinted by Mehreen just now, that or it is the Mughal women, the principal women of the court, who are holding the seal of the emperor. Whatever farman, whatever thing is prepared, वो गजब में भी prepare हो सकता है. He must be angry on something. But ultimately, after a cool down period, it is Jahanara, for example, who would put up the seal. It is Mumtaz Mahal who would put up the seal. It is Noor Jahan who would put up the seal. This was a tradition which was not started during the period of Jahangir. It was a well-established Timurid tradition already.
Yes, absolutely.
So I mean, number one, this is what I have to. I mean, as I said, that again, there is no point in going into details of this. Secondly, I would like to point out, the question was by Hussain Aziz about the role of Noor Jahan Begum, whether she was an empress or not. There are three very prominent writings which deal with that. Beni Prasad, who starts with this concept of Noor Jahan Junta, who says that it is at the point when Noor Jahan comes and marries Jahangir in 1611 that she starts wielding power. Her father, her brother, her cousins, they wield power and hold territories. Consecutive territories are being held by them. So Beni Prasad was the first to point this out. Again, Beni Prasad, remember, was writing during the colonial period. He was followed by Professor Nurul Hasan. And Professor Nurul Hasan, through an article, was there any Noor Jahan Junta? Negated everything what Beni Prasad had said and came to the conclusion that just like the Petticoat government, there was no Noor Jahan Junta at all. It was Etmatud-Daula who was having the power. He was there on his own right, not as the father of Noor Jahan. In fact, he was there even before Noor Jahan was married. This was followed by the third, very brilliantly written paper by Professor Irfan Habib, where he negated both the other two, Beni Prasad and Nurul Hasan. He negated Nurul Hasan by saying that yes, there was a period when Noor Jahan had extreme political powers concentrated in her hand. But Beni Prasad was wrong that it was the period 1611 onwards, 1611 to 22. Irfan Habib says that it is at a period when now Humayun is ill. He is bedridden. At a time when he thinks that most of the decisions he can't take independently himself. The seal is as it is in the hands of Noor Jahan. It was at that time that she gradually started developing her powers and started having, no doubt, ambitions. Not for herself. She never wanted to become the queen. She wanted her own, son-in-law, the husband of her own daughter, to succeed. And here resulted the clash between Khurram and Noor Jahan. The end result was that there was a rebellion, Mahabad Khan's rebellion. Jahangir was, in fact, in a way arrested. He was confined. Noor Jahan was virtually arrested. And when Shah Jahan came to the throne, he saw to it that Noor Jahan or any of her coterie people were never given any positions. And a lot of writings against them were also compiled, trying to bring a bad name on her. I would just say that Noor Jahan was just like any other Mughal queens or princesses from the period of Babur, from Central Asia, down to, I won't talk about Aurangzeb because we don't have any example of Aurangzeb discussing with the women at all. But at least from Babur down to Shah Jahan, this tradition continued. And that was nothing special as far as Noor Jahan was concerned. I think we have had around 1.5 hours discussion, Mehreen. It was such a lovely talk.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Some of the miniatures all of us have already seen, but we are seeing them in a new perspective altogether. I was thinking before the start of your lecture that your 1 hour would be devoted on one particular painting. So how would you do it? You did it excellently.
Thank you very much.
This is how, and that is one of the reasons that we agreed with you to have this uh, topic so that the students who listened to it, who joined us at the moment and would be looking at this video when it is uploaded, uh, they would learn a lot how to question the miniatures and how to extract history out of them. And I would say, Zainab, one of the girls who asked the question here, once upon a time she was interested in such a theme. I hope she would have benefited through this. Mehreen, I know you were not well. You came, you gave us so much time. Uh, in fact, I am also feeling very exhausted at the moment. I
Sure.
had certain questions of mine, but at a time when you were lecturing, I had messaged Shagufta that please you take up the question answer session because I am feeling giddy. But then I couldn't resist myself uh, by interjecting in between, howsoever haphazardly I might have done.
No,
Thank you
no,
very
thank
much,
you.
and I
Thank you
hope
so much.
that things become positive once again. And I hope that in future also we would be holding another series of lectures with you on some other topic.
It
Thank
would be
you.
my
Good
pleasure.
night.
Thank you so
Take care.
much. Thank you.